Hello and welcome to my series on mastering the select statement. My name is Michael Fudge. In this episode, we will learn about temporal tables. Temporal tables track changes made over time. For all intents and purposes, the table looks like a normal table. The only difference is we can add some special code to the from clause to observe or inspect what that table looks like at a point in time or over a range of time if we want to see the changes that were made to it. Okay, let's begin the demo. So what are we going to look at? What is a temporal table? How do we create a temporal table? How do we take a table and make it into a temporal table? And then last but not least, querying temporal data. And we'll look at just querying the table so you can see what's in the now. We'll look at point at time querying, like what did it look like an hour ago, a day ago? And then how to look at the changes that were made in an interval. And then if you want to see every single change that was ever made to the table, how do you do that? All right, here I am out in Azure Data Studio again. And you'll see that I have some code this time that makes my table games. And the games table has two columns, a name and a price. So here are the names of these various board games. And then here are the prices. That's just a regular table. Then what I did was I altered that table and I added two columns. And I decided to not hide these columns. Normally in a temporal table, you might hide these columns and not display them as part of the query. There's a way to make them hidden. But I included them in here so that you can get a better understanding of what is happening with our data. But the normal table is really just name and price. And if you just query the table, you just see name and price. These columns here have defaults set. The valid from default is, 1 second before the current date and 1 second before the current date and time. And the default end is always the last acceptable date in the database, which is the year 9999, 1231, 23 hours, 59 seconds, etc. These columns are required, and they always should look like this. Generated always as row start, generated always as row end, and then period for system time. You can call this column A and this column B, and then say for system time AB. I prefer to use column names like valid from, valid to. All right. Now, first and foremost, after you create your period columns like this, you can then alter the table itself and turn what's called system versioning on, and then specify what's called the history table. And what that gives you, if you look over here, is you'll see there's a little clock next to the table. And the table it looks like a normal table, but there's actually a history table to go with it down here. It's like a shadow table. And anytime you make a change to the database, that change is recorded into the history table so that we have an accurate reflection of what the data looked like in the table at a point in time. If you want to see what the data looks like right now, you just query it like a normal table, just like any other table would. But if you want to see what it looks like, an hour ago or a few minutes ago, or see the changes that were made within a 5-minute interval, you can do that. That's the real advantage of a temporal table. So in this script, I have this delay that waits a minute before doing this, and then waits another minute before doing this. So when you run the script, it's going to take about 15 minutes, go off, do something else, stretch your legs, have a beverage, whatever, because you're going to have to wait for this to go. And that's because, when you're using temporal data, you need to ensure it makes changes over time. Okay. All right, so let's get into the facet of querying this data. So we have a table called games. And this table is, just what's current in the table. You see that at one point I inserted Monopoly and it was $29.95, but now currently Monopoly is $14.95. See that? Because I made a change to the table. You don't know that the table was originally, the Monopoly price was originally $24.95. You don't know that. By looking at the current data. By the way, normally when you look at the data, it would look like this, name price. You wouldn't see the other columns there, valid from, valid to. You'd see this. And so you might want to know, hey, what was the monopoly price before it was $14.95? All right. So a couple things. There is another table called the history table, games history. And this table shows you all of the changes that have been made to the table. You can see that Monopoly is in there twice because there were 2 changes made to the table. The valid from valid to tells you the range in which this particular row was valid. If you look at, like, for example, this Yam Slam has a valid to of this date, which means that currently in the table, if we look at it, there's no Yam Slam because we deleted it from the table. But if we go back in time far enough, we can see that Yam Slam was in the table. All right. So that's basically what the temporal table is doing. Now, let's talk about how you query this data. You could certainly throw a bunch of where clauses down, where it's valid from, valid to, all that stuff. You could do that. You could query the table and the history table. But honestly, there are clauses built into from that you can use that make querying the temporal data easier. And don't litter up the where clause like the same way we used to litter up the where clause with SQL 89 join syntax, where we would put the primary foreign key in the where clause instead of in the from clause. So the temporal spec, as part of the SQL standard, has some keywords that you can add to the from clause to make querying easier. So let's talk about those now. So first of all is all. So if I say select everything from games for system time all, this retrieves all the data and all the history data from the table. It is, in essence, the union of these 2 queries. And in here, I can see, for example, Monopoly is in here 1, 2, 3 times. Let's just focus on Monopoly here. Where name is Monopoly. And we can sort of see the history of Monopoly here. It's from 1458. Well, we'll start down here. From 1452 to 1450. Well, we got to start earlier. From 1447 to 1452, it was $29.95. Then from 1452 to 1458, it was $19.95. And then from 1458 till today, tomorrow, the next day, it's $14.95. So you could sit here and play a game and say, well, let's see what it looked like, on a certain date. And you could say, well, where this and valid from and the current date that I want, which is like 2021, 03, 09, 14, let's pick a date, right? 1455, 1450. Is between valid from and valid to. And then this will give me what Monopoly looked like, in right here at this point in time, right? However, that gets complicated and confusing. It's just not a good way to query a temporal table. The way we really want to query a temporal table is to use the for clause, like so. What did the table look like at 2021, 03, 09, 1450. Let's find out. So at that point in time, there were 3 games in the table. There was Monopoly at $29.95, Catan at $39.95, and Ticket to Ride at $34.95. Let's see if we can figure this out. So first we inserted Monopoly, then we inserted Catan, then we inserted Ticket to Ride. So that point in time is right here that we're referencing. Okay. At some point we changed Monopoly again, right? So let's go further in time and see if we can see when we changed Monopoly to 1995. Let's see if we can wind time forward. So let's go 1454. There we go. Now Monopoly is 1995. If you missed that, let me do this. And then same thing at 1454. This is much easier, by the way, than querying it with some crazy where clause and trying to put this date between valid from and valid to. You don't have to do any of that stuff. Let the temporal table handle that. You should never have to query the history table directly. You should be able to pull the records from history by using the for system time clause. That's basically what you want to do in a temporal table. So this gives us a good opportunity to look at what this table looked like at that point in time. Maybe you want to see the changes that we made over time. Oh, well, let me do another thing. Maybe you want to see what this table looked like yesterday. Okay? What was in this table yesterday? You know, yesterday the table was empty. See that? And the table was empty. You know, what is it going to look like tomorrow? Well, it looks the same as it does today, right? It looks the same as it does today. Which is the same as today. All right, let's look at the changes that were made in the last. Okay, if we look through here, it looks like the very last thing that happened was Monopoly got changed again, right, to $14.95. And that happened right here. So let's do this. Let's see the things that were changed in the last 5 minutes after this point in time. So check this out. Changes made in a 5-minute interval. Select for system time from a start date. Let's just copy one of these so you don't want to have to watch me type so much. A start date to an end date. And I want my start date. I know what my end date is going to be. It's going to be this, 1458. And let's just make it 1459 on the button. And let's go to 1454. Okay. And let's see what we get. And I'm going to break this up a bit so you can. There. So that gives us a range. So those are all the changes made in that range. There's quite a few changes made in that range. Let's shorten the range up a bit. Let's go to 1457. Okay, so we have Blockus was in the table at that time. Catan was in the table at that time. Monopoly was in the table at that time, but it was $14.95. Rummy Cube was in the table, Ticket to Ride, and Word on the Street. I can wind this back a little further. This is what, a 3-minute interval? Let me wind it back a little further. A little further back. So let's do this, and then let's make the upper bound 1457, and let's make this 1454. Let's see what we get now. Okay, so, oh, I have the wrong date in here. I have 310. I got to have 39, Mike. That is a problem. 3-9. Today is 3-9. That's why I'm not seeing any. Okay, there we go. That makes more sense. All right, I had a mistake in here where I had the date as 310 and it needs to be 3-9. This is why I wasn't seeing any valid information. So these are the changes made in the 2-minute interval. And you'll see that we have quite a few changes. Monopoly's in there twice, right? Because Monopoly was made at 1450. It's in this range, 1452 to 1458. And then it's also in this range, 1458 to 14 to more after, because so the change of Monopoly occurred within this range. That's why we see it. And so let's go back a little further. Let's go 1457 to 1454. But I got to make this 9. That's why it was showing up funky. And then we see there were two changes made to word on. There was a change made to word on the street. Right? It went from 1455 to current, and then it changed on 1451 to 1455. Right, so that would be in this range here. Okay. There's also there's from and there's between. So from includes does not include the upper bound or the lower bound. So this date is not included in there in a from. But when you use the between, it includes the lower bound as well as the upper bound. So that's sort of the difference between from and between when you're doing a temporal query. So why might you want to use these range? Well, you might want to use these ranges to find all the changes that were made to the data since the last time you looked at the data. And so then you could use this type of query to find out what sort of happened. And then based on what happened, you can get an accurate reflection of how to replay those changes to another data source if you need to. Another really useful purpose of temporal data is, you know, you see these prices change, but let's suppose somebody buys. Just go back and show you one more last example. Let's suppose somebody buys Yam Slam. Well, they can't buy it now because we don't have it, right? But if we go back in time, we can see that we had Yam Slam at one point. I think it was here. There it is. So if somebody makes an order for Yam Slam between 1450 and 1457, we want Yam Slam was there. So we can use this type of query to backfill the order detail to get the price maybe of Yam Slam at the time it was purchased, right? Because we have the changes made. And a great example of that is with Monopoly, right? You know, Monopoly changes a lot in here. And so if somebody bought a Monopoly like now, they pay $14.95 for it. If they bought the Monopoly, you know, before 1458, then they paid $19.95 for it. So the price has been changing. So this way we can accurately reflect what the value was at that point in time. So that's basically the rationale behind these temporal tables, is they allow you to see the data at a point in time, query the data over time, and get a range of changes that were made to the table.